It's been called the deadliest day in the history of North America, the day Yellowstone supervolcano erupted, unleashing an amount of destruction never before seen on our continent. The air grew thick with choking ash, rivers boiled and turned to steam, and molten lava flowed across hundreds of thousands of square miles, incinerating everything that stood in its path. Cities turned to deserts, forests became glass, and entire mountain ranges were leveled. But what happens after all that? Because one thing is certain, life would go on after Yellowstone erupted, even if it didn't seem like it at first. In fact, scientists believe that the area around the Caldera could be largely habitable again within just 10 years, but only just. And beyond that, the rest of the world would experience a new ice age. So here's how we would survive the winter after Yellowstone. A volcanic eruption on this scale has never happened during the lifetime of any human being, which makes it hard to predict exactly what will happen. But scientists have done their best to estimate what might happen by looking at the geological record of past eruptions. And from this we know that Yellowstone wouldn't just erupt once. If it did, it would blow multiple times over the course of several days or weeks, spewing huge amounts of ash and debris into the atmosphere. This would block out the sun and plunge the whole of North America into darkness for months. Temperatures would plummet, crops would fail, and storms would rage. In short, there would be a winter of discontent, but it would only be the beginning. In total, more than 200 billion tons of debris would be thrown into the air, which is enough to cover every inch of the United States in more than 6 inches of ash. Most of this ash would settle in the western half of the country. It would rain down in thick layers, turning day into night. A fine powder would coat the landscape, mixing with water and mud to form a thick, soupy sludge. This would bury towns, poisoning the water supply and killing off most forms of life. The air would become thick with ash and noxious gases, including sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide. These gases would kill many of the remaining animals, while others, like birds, insects, and some mammals, would simply fly away or run away. Those animals that couldn't move fast enough would die, leaving behind a landscape littered with carcasses. But not everywhere would be affected in the same way. Areas closest to the volcano would be hit hardest. Within 80 kilometers of the park, everything would be incinerated by pyroclastic flows. Within 160 kilometers, trees would be scorched and turned to ash. Beyond that, the landscape would become increasingly charred and lifeless, until, roughly 320 kilometers from the volcano, the air would become too thin to support life. Only those people who had evacuated these areas would survive, along with a handful of animals and plants that managed to flee. We'll come back to them in a minute because their story is one of hope. But first, let's look at what would happen next. Within 10 years, it might seem like nothing had happened at all. Lush green forests would once again cover the land, and wildlife would abound. Scientists believe that hardy species of plants and animals that fled the area would return to find that conditions had changed dramatically. Without the usual predators, prey animals would flourish. Birds would lay more eggs, and larger litters of mammals would survive to adulthood. Evolution would be on fast forward, and ecosystems would rapidly evolve to suit the survivors. And humans would be among the animals that would adapt to these changes. But to do that, we'd need to rebuild. Luckily, the US government has already thought about this. In the event of a Yellowstone eruption, they would deploy 100,000 emergency workers to help the survivors. These would include firefighters to battle the inevitable wildfires, doctors and nurses to treat the sick and injured, and even psychologists to help people cope with the trauma of the eruption. The government would also drop food, water, and supplies from planes to those stranded in the ash. But for those who survived the winter after Yellowstone, the struggle to stay alive would only just begin. They would face famines, disease outbreaks, and dwindling supplies of clean water. And to make matters worse, the weather would turn against them, because as the ash cleared from the sky, it would reveal a world in chaos. Even though Yellowstone is located deep in the heart of the United States, its eruption would affect people on every continent. The debris thrown into the atmosphere would spread around the globe, blocking sunlight and cooling the planet. For the first few months, temperatures would drop just a few degrees, which might not sound like much, but it would have a devastating impact. Crops would fail, livestock would die, and starvation would become widespread. Eventually, however, the temperatures would drop much further. In the northern hemisphere, winter would arrive early and last longer than normal, and as the years dragged on, things would get much, much worse. An ice age would begin, and the Earth would enter a new ice age that lasted hundreds or even thousands of years. During this time, most of the world would become a frozen wasteland. Only those living near the equator would be spared the worst of the cold, but even there, rainfall would be less reliable, and growing food would become harder. So surviving the winter after Yellowstone would require a complete change in the way we live. Many of the technologies that we rely on would no longer work. Farming equipment would rust in the fields, food processing plants would grind to a halt, and without fuel, cars, trucks, trains, and planes would be grounded. Even the power grid would collapse, plunging cities into darkness and shutting down hospitals and emergency services. Within a year, most major cities would be abandoned, leaving behind a landscape littered with decaying buildings and overgrown highways. But despite all of these challenges, humans would endure. Just as we have done in the past, we would learn to grow food in the cold, hunt and gather wild food, and build shelters from the materials at hand. We would forge new communities based on cooperation and mutual aid, where everyone would pull together to survive. It would be a struggle, but eventually we would prevail and build a new civilization in the shadow of the old. In fact, this isn't just speculation. Scientists have studied the effects of previous volcanic eruptions and found that humans have always bounced back, albeit slowly. For example, the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815 caused the year without summer and killed tens of thousands of people. But afterwards, agriculture recovered, and people began to rebuild their lives. Similarly, the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 also caused major climatic disruption, but people adapted, and the economy recovered. In other words, humans are remarkably resilient, and we would find a way to survive the winter after Yellowstone, even if it meant starting from scratch. But there is one group of people whose story deserves special attention. As we've seen, the immediate aftermath of the eruption would be devastating. Whole cities would be wiped off the map, leaving behind scenes of unimaginable horror. In the aftermath, the lucky survivors would emerge from their shelters and emerge into a world that was unrecognizable. Some would be traumatized by what they had seen and struggled to cope with the loss of their loved ones. Others would be angry, blaming the government or scientists for not doing more to prevent the disaster. Some would be scared, unsure of what to do next or how to survive in a world that had been turned upside down. But through it all, there would be heroes. Firefighters and emergency workers would risk their lives to save others. Doctors and nurses would work around the clock to treat the sick and injured, and ordinary citizens would come together to help each other out. They would share food and supplies, care for the elderly and disabled, and protect their neighbors. In short, the eruption of Yellowstone would bring out the best and worst of humanity. But ultimately, it would be the best that would prevail. Humanity would survive the winter after Yellowstone because we are adaptable, resourceful, and above all, tenacious. We will never give up. Now, watch what happens to your body when exposed to nuclear radiation, or check out how to survive a nuclear fallout. Winter.